Hello and welcome to Black Bear Atheist. Today we're back on track, checking out more on Frank Turek's video. I went off track and then did some video on this guy that's Frank Stephen. He has some videos and his channel is named Nigerian Perspective on stuff. I think it's just a Nigerian perspective. I watched what he thought of Islam and how it treats women, and on the topic of submission in Christianity, the alpha or whatever the heck he really is saying. If you have time, check out those videos. They're pretty interesting, just my thoughts. I think I'm gonna do some venturing into like Nigerian pastors, idiots like him, maybe that comes from Nigeria, talking about shit that are just bullshitting, giving dumb stats and like trying to look smart, but really they're dumb. In this first video, I gave him praise as my Nigerian brother. In the second video, it was simply bullshitting, and I don't think bullshitting is a good thing. So I gave him a piece of my mind. He probably will never find the video. If he does, I mean, I would love if he do. So back on Frank Turek. That was a long intro, and I don't like long intros. Let's go.
There are two questions for investigating reliability of the New Testament. Now, why are we just looking at the New Testament? Because if the New Testament is true, the Old Testament is true. Why?
I don't know where the fuck he got that from, but no. If the New Testament is true, the Old Testament, it doesn't still make it true. There are people who believe. I found this interesting. I was having a conversation with this guy through YouTube chat, which is where I found like I need to make like my YouTube channel through YouTube chat, and it was like, well, the God of the Old Testament is not the true God. It's not the Father that Jesus was talking about. And I was like, what? Jesus is a Jewish man that followed the Jewish law. He was obviously talking about the Father. When he's referring to the Father, he's talking about Yahweh. Yes, there was actually a section of these people. We thought they all like got eradicated by the Catholic Church, but they survived apparently. There's a set of people in the Holy Church that believe the Old Testament is bullshit and Jesus wasn't even talking about them. That was not the God Jesus was referring to. That was actually most likely devil that led people away from the true God. Interesting, isn't it? Religion is interesting. It's just, it is annoying.
Because if Jesus really did and said the things the New Testament says he said and did, then he was God. And if Jesus was God, then whatever he taught was true, right? And
okay, so I made another video. I guess I'm gonna make this an ad now. I made another video on Frank Turek talking about law of non-contradiction and talking about logic. And I said at the end, Jesus can be God and at the same time be Jesus. No, I don't think that's what I said. I said 3 cannot be equal 1. God can be Jesus and the Holy Ghost at the same time just be God. God can be 3 and be 1 at the same time. Law of non-contradiction.
Jesus taught that the Old Testament was true. So if the New Testament's true, the Old Testament's true as well. So we could give evidence for the
He taught it, so who cares?
Old, but we're going to look at the New and say if it's true, then so is the Old. Let's take a look at the two questions we need to look at to figure out if the New Testament's true. First question, do we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents? There's a lot of people out there who say no, that Jesus sent.
Bro, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We don't have an actual account of someone who actually met Jesus. That is a problem for you to solve.
Our people some liberals at many major institutions. In fact, the University of North Carolina has some professors.
It's not liberals that is your deal here. It's scholars, and they actually think you're bullshitting, Frank. They don't think you're actually telling the truth.
At it. Chapel Hill. Bart Ehrman's one of them. He wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus.
Well, he's a scholar, not some just liberal. He's a scholar that actually studies the Bible. So, again, interesting. No actual account. You don't have an actual account of someone that actually met Jesus. That is an issue when he's the savior of the entire fucking planet. That's your claim, at least.
Where he says we can't trust the manuscripts. He's all wrong, but that's what he says.
Well, because some of the words are not actually Jesus' words. They're not the things Jesus said. Like some claims that Jesus is God, it's probably not what Jesus said, because Jesus is a Jewish teacher. And he understands that he can't be God, and he did not thought that either.
Second question is, do we have the original, or do the original New Testament documents tell the truth?
Do they?
Because
I don't think so.
we can have an...
Shut up, Frank. No, they do not. They do not talk about the truth.
Accurate copy of the New Testament documents, but that doesn't mean those documents tell us the truth, right? We can have an accurate copy of a lie, right? I mean, the Quran could have been accurately copied throughout the centuries, but that doesn't mean the Quran's true, right? Just because you have an accurate copy doesn't mean it's true. So we got to answer both these questions. Now, I don't have enough time to do question one. Let me just give...
Oh, these horny bitches. Anyways, the Quran and the Bible are both bullshit, and they both have no evidence supporting any of their claims, really. They're historical, like, even just on the same boat, Frank, on the same boat. You both are on the same boat.
Give you the conclusion. Yes. Okay, you can get the book and figure it out. But let's do question two, and I'm going to give you 4 reasons why we can trust the New Testament documents. There's a chapter, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, the top 10 reasons we know the New Testament.
Of course, he advertised his book. While he's doing that, I am going to also say, like and subscribe. I need to grow my channel.
Writers told the truth. I'm just going to give you 4. You ready? Here we go. We have early testimony. They all begin with the letter E, so it'll help you out. We have early testimony. We have eyewitness testimony. We have embarrassing testimony. And we have excruciating testimony. Let's go.
It's going to break it down. I think he never really does that, but early testimony, not really. Decades, they were decades later. They were actually written decades later. So, again, not early eyewitness testimony. No, you have account. You have eyewitness accounts of accounts. Not actually the eyewitness writing it down, because they couldn't probably have wrote it down. Guess what? Guess why? Guess why? The Jesus that came to save humanity, decided to not go at the center of the Roman Empire, where he could have probably have a bunch of people write about him, but decided to went into the middle of nowhere, where nobody will write about him, where there will be no evidence of his life. Does that make any sense to you? No. This guy is supposed to be all-knowing. By the way, he's still God. Fully God, fully... When you put religion... No, you know what? I'm wasting too much time on this. It doesn't make sense. I'll just say that. Next. What was the third one? Next, it's embarrassing. Okay. Does that make it true? No. In this other video, he tries to say, oh, because it's the New Testament is embarrassing, it has to be true. No, that's just one of the ways historians try to find out whether what they're saying is true. Just because it's embarrassing doesn't make it true. The story is like, I think there was one of the tragedy writers that wrote a lot about like women, make women as main characters in his strategy, does that make the story true? Even though back then, really, women can't even act the position of a woman. All of them has to be men. Men are the only one that can act in those stages. So making does is the story true because a woman was a main character, and it's technically embarrassing, and it's technically not widely accepted. They don't see women as equal to men. No, it doesn't.
Through each one of these in order. Early testimony. Now, what I'm about to say, if what I'm about to say is true, you might as well just wipe out every liberal New Testament department at your major
Liberal. Frank is so fucking political and he doesn't either, and I'm okay with that.
university. Because what I'm about to say contradicts what they say. Let's take a look. Early testimony. Let's look back at the first century for just a couple minutes. You see 30 AD all the way up to 70 AD. There are two major events that all historians agree on, bookends. We've got the cross occurring sometime in the early 30s, and we've got the temple and the entire city of Jerusalem being destroyed by Titus, the Roman general, in 70 AD. Now, what's going on between those two bookends of time? Let's take a look. We know that Paul was killed at the hands of Nero sometime in the late 60s. That's commonly accepted by historians. We know that James, the half-brother of Jesus, was killed at the hands of the Sanhedrin. How do we know? Does the Bible tell us? No. You know who tells us? The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived from 37 AD to about 100 AD. He tells us that in 63 AD, James, the half-brother of Jesus, was killed at the hands of the Sanhedrin. Why was he killed? Apparently because he was a Christian. He was the leader of the Jerusalem church, and the Sanhedrin didn't like that. Now, we all know that James, according to John chapter 7, didn't believe Jesus was God when he was walking around the earth.
Nobody
but in
did.
1 Corinthians 15,
Nobody thought he was God. How can a God die? How can a God that you worship die? See why this doesn't make any sense?
Paul tells us that the risen Christ appeared to James, and suddenly he then becomes a leader of the Jerusalem church. You think the appearance had something to do with that? Because I know a lot of people in here probably have a brother who thinks he's God, don't you? Okay? You need some proof. Well, James ultimately got it.
My brother claimed he's God. Well, obviously, I would need some proof. But James' brother, Jesus, never claimed to be God. He was a cult leader.
We know that Acts is written by 62 AD. I don't have time to get into the evidence for that, but it's in the book. We know that 1 Corinthians is written by 55 AD. And
Decades later, after the event.
1 Corinthians, by the way, has probably the best evidence for the resurrection in it. In fact, in 1 Corinthians, there's a creed. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. Go home, read 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. That's a creed that Paul received when he first became an apostle. He verbally told it to the Corinthians, and then in 1 Corinthians, he wrote it to them. And he said, remember I told you about this? Here it is in writing. That creed, scholars believe, goes all the way back to the event itself. In the early 30s, that creed, which they memorized orally, if you read it, you can see a rhythm to it, that Jesus died and rose again. That creed is very early. Now, there's a lot going on here.
Does that make it true? No, it doesn't.
If Acts is written by 62, what's written before that? Who wrote the book of Acts? Luke. So he wrote the Gospel of Luke before the book of Acts. Why? Because the first verse of the book of Acts says, in my former work, O excellent Theophilus. What's the former work? Luke. If Luke is early, then many believe Mark.
No, Luke did not write Luke. Like, there's no evidence for that. They were anonymous writers. We actually don't know who wrote the first four chapters of the first 4 books of the Bible. We don't know. because they were anonymous. I think including Act. Half of what Paul wrote, which was like 6 or 7, were the ones that we know Paul actually wrote. There's 13 dedicated to him, and he wrote at least 6 or 7.
Mark is earlier than Luke, and I personally believe Matthew is the first gospel written. So we've got early.
So who gives a fuck about your personal? I believe Mark was the first one written. I think it is. I think it is. Anyways,
Testimony. Even without Matthew, you've got Luke and Mark.
it doesn't matter which one was the first. What matters is that all of them were anonymous, and they were all decades later. And they were not by eyewitnesses, but by oral traditions. So where's your eyewitness coming from? See, Frank, you just disprove your own bullshit. How can there be eyewitness when it's oral tradition being passed down decades later and then written down?
Mark and the Creed. Now, I may be going out on a limb here, so tell me if I am, but I think that Paul had to have written all of his works before he died. Is that a fair?
No, they could just dedicate to him after he died and say it was by him, which is what they did, and which is what we find out is not true.
Assumption? All right. What are the undisputed works of Paul? 1 Corinthians, Romans, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians. Yeah, there's other works too, but that's all you need to prove the resurrection. Now the real kicker. I personally think that most, if not all, the New Testament's written before 70 AD. Why? Because there's not a whiff of the entire country of Jerusalem, or of Israel, being destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. Not a whiff.
Okay, so I don't care what you think, Frank. It's what the historians find out that I care about. You're not an historian, but an apologetic that do a terrible job. So, nobody gives a fuck, except for your Christian population, apparently.
It's predicted, Jesus predicts it in Matthew 24, but nobody ever says, look, it happened. Now let me ask you a question. Suppose you're reading a book about Lower Manhattan, and it talks about how the World Trade Towers were built in the 70s. But then there's no mention about the World Trade Towers being destroyed by Muslim terrorists on 9/11. When are you going to assume that book was written? Before 9/11. Or you're reading a biography of Dr. Martin Luther King. You read about his whole life, and the book ends, and there's nothing in there about his assassination. When are you going to assume the book was written? Before he was assassinated?
No, they could just take that part out, because it doesn't really matter. There was a big part of his life, and they don't need to explain the part where he died. You can't do that. You can do that in a biography. Well, the Bible doesn't have an actual biography of anything, really. Not even the life of Jesus. It just tells a story that is fake.
Assassinated. The same thing's going on in the New Testament. In the New Testament, 70 AD was far more traumatic an experience to those people than was 9/11 in our life. They just didn't lose a couple of buildings and 3,000 of their beloved citizens. They lost their entire country. Their temple was destroyed. Their city was destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of their countrymen were killed. Josephus called it the greatest war of all time. They lost their entire country. They never even got back there till 1948.
Yeah, I don't think that was the classic greatest war of all time. It was probably being biased. Actually, it definitely was being biased. Moving on.
And yet, nothing is mentioned in any New Testament document about that.
I'm not sure when the last doctrine in the New Testament was written. Honestly, fuck it, I'll just search it up. Okay, so a quick Google search told me that it's between 40 AD and 90 AD. So it's between 70. It's after 70 AD that the last one was written. So whatever you say at this point, Frank, nobody cares about what you think.
What does that lead you to believe?
Just fucking present evidence.
that it had to have been written before 70 AD. You say that's an argument from silence. No, it's not just an argument from silence, because there are scriptures or there are references in the New Testament documents which presuppose the temple is still standing when they're writing it. If this is written before 70 AD, that knocks out just about every liberal argument to the eyewitness early nature of these documents. In fact, this period is during the age of the eyewitnesses. It's very difficult for during the age of the eyewitnesses for historical revisionists to change things around. Why? Because people know the eyewitnesses are still around to correct falsehoods. It's only after the eyewitnesses are dead and gone do the historical revisionists really do their best work. You're just seeing now that people...
This guy is tripping. How many times have you guys played this game? Which is, I've never played, but I've seen, people play. You tell someone, actually, I have played this before. You whisper something to someone's ear from this hand, and then they pass it on. And by the hand, you get a whole different thing. Yes, that is real. People trust their memories to be good, but it's actually not good. There's been evidence of this. There's been studies on this. So, no, the eyewitnesses first of all, are not the best accounts. Second of all, we don't actually have written down accounts of actual eyewitness, Frank. This is not even a debate. This is what the scholars agree on. Those that actually study the Bible and study history. Who are you? Just an apologetics that lie for a living.
People...
And I can present evidence for that. He does lie for a living. And I'm sure he understands that historians actually agree that it's between 40 AD and 90 AD that the Bible was written, the New Testament. I'm also sure he knows that there is no evidence for the resurrection. I'm also sure that he knows his New Testament is bullshit. But hey, when you're indoctrinated into bullshit, you provide bullshit. When you believe bullshit, you end up bullshitting everything. And that is what Frank is doing. So yes, Frank is lying and he knows it.
A lot more people are denying the Holocaust existed. I mean, people have always denied that, but a lot more now. Why? Because we're losing the greatest generation at about a rate of 1,000 a day in this country. The eyewitnesses are dying off. And historical revision.
No, a lot more idiots are existing apparently to be saying, "Oh, the Holocaust didn't exist." Shut up. We have evidence for that. That is not how it works.
Are going to work. They couldn't have done it during New Testament times. It would have been very difficult to do. There's more evidence in the book you can look at.
Okay, so that's it, and it's just basically bullshit. Early testimony for the New Testament are just bullshit. Again, we don't actually have account of actual eyewitnesses. You can search this up. I am not making this up. That's it for today. Have a great day.